Things changed yesterday after Long Beach and LA County made a change about mask requirements, and so the choir isn't singing this morning, so we won't have the pleasure, but we will at some future breath to hear "Oh Happy Day." And we wear masks not only to protect ourselves, not only to protect the vulnerable in our community and those that we love and care about, for example, my nephew who has lupus, but we also wear masks so we will not become inadvertent carriers for a virus that then allows it to mutate and create a variant that will spread and change this world even more than it has been changed. And that is why we come together masked this morning. Tom and I are getting used to this liturgy, getting used to the order of worship, getting used to be physical and present, so you'll have to bear with us if we make mistakes along the way. So here we are. When my mother was 55, she had a major stroke. She had a rheumatic heart, rheumatic fever as a child, and had a valve that was weak. When she was being prepped for an operation to have that valve replaced, they took her off blood thinners, and she threw a clot. She had the results of that stroke in her body for the rest of her life. She lived another 20 years. I was in seminary and would go home on weekends, and my sister and I took turns taking care of her. And my niece, my sister's daughter, would often be the assistant, taking care of Grandma. She was about 7 or 8 years old. And one day, while moving my mother in the bed, Sylvie was there, and she said, "I wish God was real." I said, "What do you mean?" And she said, with that eye roll that she would soon become famous for, "He's only a spirit." Will you pray with me? Oh God, here we are again, trying our best to work out what it means to be human, what it means to have ears, what it means to have eyes, what it means to be us. Help us be present this morning, and may our words be, if nothing else, useful for your world. Amen. And now another story. It was a first or maybe second date with somebody. We were sitting there, and she took a big mouthful of food, and she looked at me and said, "So can you explain predestination to me?" This is why clergy can't date. And I said, well, the problem comes in when as soon as you start talking about God. Because as soon as you start talking about God, you start suggesting that God is all-powerful and omnipresent and created everything and knows everything. And if God knows everything, then God knows what's going to happen in your life. God knows the choices you're going to make. God knows how enlightened you might become. God knows whether or not you will be saved. And if you are John Calvin, blessed be his name, you will eventually find yourself up against the wall of creating the theory of double predestination. Anybody who knows what that is, and I don't mean seminary graduates or clergy, anybody else know what double predestination, there may be a prize, double predestination. Nobody? Could have been a salad spinner. Double predestination is this, that not only does God know who's going to be saved, but God knows who's going to be damned to hell. Which means God creates people predestined to be saved and doubly predestined to be damned. Oh my gosh is right. Those are our forebears. See how talking about God can get you into trouble? The Psalms talk about God all the time. They have no fear talking about God. And scholars argue about, who wrote the Psalms? What is the context in which they were written? They were liturgical pieces. They were poetry to be used in the temple in worship services. Some think that many of the Psalms are actually commissioned pieces, that somebody had a particular concern or problem in their life, and they went to the temple and they paid a certain amount of money, and they could get a psalm, a long one or a short one, I don't know. And they argue about Psalm 23 because they categorize the Psalms. Are they Psalms of thanksgiving? Are they Psalms of personal distress? Are they Psalms of supplication? What sort of psalm is this Psalm 23? Psalm 23, if I just say Psalm 23, instantly we all think of sheep, shepherds, right? But we forget that in the middle of that psalm, there is a sudden turn. There's a sudden complete change in the metaphor. We're no longer on some pasture being cared for by a shepherd who is leading us down the nice paths and keeping us safe from predators. All of a sudden, God is a host at the table, from a shepherd to host. For the Israelites, God as hospitality itself was very important. There are stories throughout the Hebrew Bible of people being hospitable to strangers, to aliens, to orphans and widows, to people on the margins, to people you did not know. That was your call and duty to enact God in the world, was to be hospitable. So it is perfectly appropriate that the psalm goes from this personal caretaking to all of a sudden this overflowing table and this hospitality. This whoever you are, wherever you are on life's journey, you are welcome here. And Brooke Nelson, in the contemporary reading that Julie did for us, turns the tables on that a little bit, because it's not so much how we experience God, but how God experiences the world. Does God taste cilantro? Does God laugh? Does God, which sends us back to the psalm, what does it feel like to be a shepherd and be divine, to be a host and be God? What does a shepherd mean to the creator of shepherds? Now, this is not exactly the same as the Mary Oliver mysticism of ordinary things. If you are familiar with Mary Oliver's poetry, she takes the things that we see, the color of a flower, the feel of a leaf, the smoothness of wood, and she meditates on those things and finds divine in them. But for Brooke Nelson's poem, it's how God relates to those things and not so much how we experience God within them. J.D. Salinger, in his novel Franny and Zoe, I think to say J.D. Salinger is to all of a sudden generate an age, doesn't it? People read Catcher in the Rye anymore? I don't know. It was pretty hip to do when I was a kid. That and Mad Magazine. So anyway, J.D. Salinger takes what is ordinary and says something a little different about it in terms of its relationship to humanness and creation and hospitality. He writes, if it's the religious life you want, You ought to know right now that you're missing out on every single religious action that's going on around this house. You don't even have enough sense, he writes, to drink when somebody brings you a cup of consecrated chicken soup. So just tell me, if you went out and searched the whole world for a master, some guru, some holy man to tell you how to say your Jesus prayer properly, what good would it do you? How in the heck are you going to recognize a legitimate holy man when you can't even see one, if you don't even know a cup of consecrated chicken soup when it's right in front of your nose? So we're talking about God this morning. In our progressive Protestant world, we tend to think about our relationship to religion as an ethical and moral stance we take. Things we feel about what is really welcoming, what is really true and real about being a Christian in this world. And we often forget that part of the injunction to be a Congregationalist, here it comes, is to work out what you believe for yourself, which doesn't mean that you find something comfortable, get yourself comfortable, and sit there in it for the rest of your life. You are called, every single one of us in these pews is called to work this out daily, minute by minute, moment by moment. What does this mean, this God thing? What does it mean to be a Christian? Who the heck is Jesus? What else is there, really? Another vision of God. Who here, oh, be still my beating heart, let somebody, heard of Lord Buckley? Did I see a hand? No. Yes! Lord Buckley, born in California, Tuolumne, born in the Central Valley, British father, California mother. He was a jazz comic from the 40s and 50s, died 1960, had a stroke in New York City and a fight about a cabaret license. That's another story. But he wrote these pieces that are extraordinary bits of performance art and poetry and humor, and he often played in jazz clubs. And this is one of his pieces called Religion. And I have to tell you, it takes a certain amount of chutzpah to do Lord Buckley from a pulpit. Pleased, flipped, and grooved by this very, very gracious group of lords and ladies here at the Marquis de Mouple's traveling palace of joy. Like I explained to you before, I'm a people worshiper. I think people should worship people. I really do. I went out looking for God the other day, and I couldn't pin him. So I figured if I couldn't find him, I'd look for his stash, his great lake of love that holds the whole world in gear. And when I finally found it, I had the great pleasure of finding that people were the guardians of it. Dig it. So with my 2 times 2 is 4, I figured that if people were guarding the stash of love known as God, then when people swing in beauty, they become little gods and goddesses. And I know a couple of them myself personally. I know you do too. And I think people should worship people. I like to worship something, you see. Get my brains on, I don't know, that Jehovah cat. I can't reach him. I don't know. I seemed like every time I find myself in a bind, I always, nothing mystic came along to help me. But some man or some woman stepped up there and said, we'll help you. We'll do this. We'll do that. That's the way it looks to me. So recently on the San Bernardino Freeway, I got hung up in an old junker car going to Las Vegas, Nevada. Right in the middle of the freeway during the rush hour, it conked out. Got a weak clutch. What are you doing? Let it in. Don't step on it. Oh, it was a madhouse. Like having lunch in the middle of the Indianapolis Speedway. About 3 days went by, and finally somebody came along. Finally came along God. There were two of them. There was a big God and a little God, and they didn't know me from a. But they pushed and they pulled and they tugged and they twisted and they yanked and they gave me every possible assistance in the world and finally got me on my way. I haven't seen them since. But I think that people, and I hope I haven't offended anybody's religious beliefs, but I think that people should worship people. I really do. And that's Lord Buckley's take on religion. Octavia Butler, another Californian, born in Pasadena. Who's heard of Octavia Butler? Writer of science fiction, African-American, winner of the Nebula Prize, and she wrote a dystopian trilogy called the Parable series. And in that, she has her main character create a religion. And the key thing in that religion that's created in these books is that God is change. So that anything that happens that changes things, in that moment when you are dislocated, in that moment when you wonder what's going to happen next, in that moment when there is change, in that very moment, that is where God is. Nicholas de Cusa, 15th century, church theologian, he was always asking, how is it, O God, that you can feel so present to me and to everybody else at the same time? How are you one and all? He flirted with pantheism, which in those days probably would have gotten him a ticket onto a burning stake, but it didn't. So many ways to talk about God. So many ways, and we should take nothing for granted. This summer, I'm going to come back a bit to this theme about experiencing God, about who the heck is Jesus, a little bit about what it is out there for our longing to catch on to. We long for people. We long for people who love to swim in deep water. Don't take anything for granted. Don't find yourself in a bath that starts out hot and let it get tepid. We long for people who are willing to relentlessly pursue what is real, who, like my niece at the beginning, wants a real God, not just a spirit. Don't let anything trap you in the net of certainty. We're going to end with a poem by Mark Nepo called Where is God? There are so many other things to consider. God she, God he, God they. We haven't gotten to the poem yet. God they. There are things to consider. Is God present in suffering? Does God create suffering? You must ask yourselves these questions. The poem is called Where is God? It's as if what is unbreakable, the very pulse of light, of life, waits for everything else to be torn away. And then in the bareness that only silence and suffering and great love can expose, it dares to speak through us and to us. It seems to say, if you want to last, hold on to nothing. If you want to know love, let in everything. If you want to feel the presence of everything, stop counting the things that get broken along the way. Amen.